We've seen how important a hard bargaining position is, and that one of the key ways to be able to achieve and maintain a hard bargaining position without the risk of your opponent doing likewise and incurring the potential of mutual costs is to effectively demonstrate your own commitment to your hard position, to get that commitment in first and hard so that it leaves your opponent with little room to manoeuvre and that they are encouraged to soften their bargaining position because of the risk of those mutual high costs of the default position being incurred. So it's important to think about how we can use these commitment strategies, how we can use the expression of commitment effectively to reinforce this hard bargaining strategy. How do we make commitments? And crucially, how do we abandon commitments when that becomes tactically necessary or useful in turn? So, the making of commitment, the establishment of commitment is principally bound up with the way in which we're able to communicate our position. Now, it's often the case that, particularly when we're attempting to communicate verbally within a negotiation, that the more clarity we are able to establish with regard to a particular issue or position, then the more we're able to demonstrate a strong commitment. A clear, firm statement indicates a much greater degree of commitment than a woolly, ambiguous, uncertain statement of a position. So verbal clarity, the ability to express and communicate, and that degree of clarity is a very important element in the expression of commitment. There are three dimensions to this verbal clarity. The first one being the degree of finality, the extent to which this statement is to be regarded as the statement on this issue. That there are not going to be any further additional explanations, or there aren't going to be any little attenuations or changes here and there. But this, what I am saying here, represents the position, our position on this thing. So the degree of finality is important. The second element in terms of clarity is the degree of specificity. And again, this is about how clear we are able to establish our position on one position, on one issue or another. So how specific we are. We're not beating around the bush. We're not unclear about the thing that we're referring to. Very clear, very specific. And the third element is about the consequence. So that statement of, this is what we require or else. And that or else, and the significance of that or else, the significance of the consequence, is a very important element in just how firm that commitment that you're trying to express will be understood. So these explicit verbal forms of communication, the greater the clarity, the clearer the specificity, the degree of finality, the consequence, the more able that we are to express in these terms, then the more effectively we'll be able to harden our position and communicate our firm commitment to a particular position. Now, sometimes we may want to use more subtle forms of communication. So we may use tacit communication, where we say something without actually saying it. Maybe we use in a code, or maybe we use in body language, or we just establish an eye contact to reinforce the point that we're making. Now, the benefit of tacit forms of communication is that it allows us to say something without actually having to say it, which means that we can avoid the consequences of that if it all turns out wrong. So if we have to retreat from something, if we want to try and indicate the possibility of a concession without actually saying it, if we want to indicate that we may be softening our position and to see what the consequences of that might be, that if we give way on something that they may move into a different area or take a different stance on a related issue, that all of these things allow us to play with the dynamics of the bargain without actually committing us to anything. So tacit communication, saying without saying, is a very important form of communication that we can make use of in order to either strengthen or potentially soften our commitment to one position or another. So the form of communication is important, and the way that we use that communication is important. But who we express commitments to is also very important. So there are a number of different audiences that a bargainer might attempt to communicate with. The first audience is a very obvious one, your principals, the people whose interests you represent as a bargaining agent. Now, if we make a commitment to them, then that becomes a very, very firm commitment. It's very difficult to make a commitment to your principals and then change your position on that matter. So if we want to communicate to our bargaining opponent that we are fundamentally committed to a particular position, then you should make it as obvious as possible that you have communicated that to your principals, that you have made a firm commitment, not just to your bargaining opponent, but to the people that you represent, that you have raised their expectations, that this is what you are going to deliver. Now that puts your role as bargaining agent on the line, so it's a risky strategy, but it's as a statement of a very firmly held position. Making a commitment to your principles is a very, very clear line in the sand. Similarly, if we make a commitment to third parties, say for example we go out of a bargain, we speak to the media, we talk to third parties, people aren't actually engaged in this, but you are making a reputational claim. You're saying, I will not walk away from this negotiation with less than, or without having achieved, or whatever that might be. So that again is a very firm form of commitment. And the third audience for your bargaining positions is your opponent. That if we make a commitment to our opponents, now of course we are always doing this to some extent, but we make a commitment which we then have to retreat from, then we lose face. And the potential is that our opponent will then see that as weakness and will see the potential to drive further forward in other areas as well. So we need to think about not just what we say and how we say it in terms of our statements of commitment, of what we're committed to within a negotiation, but also to whom. Now, we can also underscore our commitments in various ways. So if we want to identify a particular item as being of absolutely crucial importance to us in the negotiation, and sometimes we don't want to do that because we want to obscure its importance and hide it in one way, but sometimes we may want to say, this is absolutely important to us, we will not retreat on this. Then we can do a variety of different things. The first thing that we might do would be to increase its prominence. So this is the opposite to hiding an issue within a whole other set of issues. But we may put it front and centre. There are all kinds of things that we want to negotiate on, but our key objective is X. And so the whole focus of the negotiation becomes around that. And it becomes very clear to your opponent that that is a thing that we are not able to retreat on, not simply because the expectations are principles are one thing or another, but because that is the key issue in the negotiation. And any failure around that represents a more substantive failure across the negotiation as a whole. So it becomes less of something that we're able to bargain over. Now, it does indicate that other issues then become subsequently less important. And so those are very quickly seen as potential bargaining chips. But if we want to identify a key issue, we underscore it. We underscore that particular bargaining item, then we increase its prominence. We can also identify, kind of, again, playing with our opponent's minds a little bit, playing with their perceptions. So sometimes we might want to underscore the importance of a particular bargaining point or a bargaining stance by making claims to its obviousness. That this is clearly just, or this is clearly fair, or we might note precedents that, well, we've always done this, or this has always been the case, or in company after company this has been agreed, why can't we do this here? You make it seem natural. You may call on underpinning principles like fairness and justice in order to note that, well, to not agree to this then would be to require you to defend not applying these principles that are commonly held, fairness, motherhood, and an apple pie. That these are all just things that, well, we all agree on this, so how can't you agree to that? We call on other underpinning principles. Now, if we've got all of these mechanisms, we can communicate firmness in a variety of different ways. But then the tactical question also has to take into consideration how much firmness we should communicate in any particular situation. Because if we push this too far, if we puff ourselves up as being absolutely committed to a particular position and then find that objectively we have to retreat because we haven't got the strength to pursue the position, or we find that our opponents are equally committed, if we've effectively painted ourselves into a corner, trying to retreat from that position can be very difficult, and we end up looking more weak than we otherwise might have. And we may also have committed the almost fatal error of raising expectations on our own side rather too high. So we do need to be careful with this and play our cards sensibly, and to not overplay the hand that we've been dealt. So we work within our objective strength to not overplay the position that we have. And this is why it's very important that we're not only aware of and make use of intelligence about the other side, but we're also aware of our own position and the limits to what we can reasonably deliver in terms of a negotiation. Sometimes we might want to push the firmness a little bit further than we might otherwise do in order to deliberately give ourselves room to rein back from there. That we push quite hard on an issue in order to then use that bargaining position as a bargaining chip. So we establish this thing as being quite important to us and we're quite ambitious, but then maybe we will come back from that position in order to gain an advantage around another issue entirely, effectively providing some headroom for ourselves to retreat. Now obviously we need to play this carefully so that we don't look weak and don't cause ourselves a problem in other ways, but it's one of the tactics that we might use. So commitment is very important. Commitment is something that we play with carefully. And for that reason, one of the things we need to be very cautious about in a negotiation is about making threats, especially if they're threats that we can't deliver. So making a threat to have something unpleasant happen to our bargaining opponent unless our demand is acquiesced to, that might help us in terms of our relationship with our own side in the short term, but unless we can deliver on that, we run into problems. And we will run into some problems with this anyway, because as soon as we've made a threat, our opponent has to think about how they look in responding to that. So if they retreat in the face of a threat, then they look weak and they lose face. So you have to think about how you provide the opportunity for your opponent to give you what you want without making them look bad for their principles. It's a complex game of cat and mouse, as we've said before. So we need to be very cautious with things like threats. If we're going to use them, we have to be very clear that we can deliver on that. So that means that we need to underscore those threats with something. It can't just be words. So we have to show willingness, and we have to be able to demonstrate willingness to fulfill that threat. Maybe we have to show that we're making preparations to fulfill that threat, building a strike fund, identifying strike breakers, whatever that might be, that we're making those preparations. So we will do what it is that we're saying we're going to do. And maybe we build up momentum towards that threat by creating and fulfilling minor threats so that it encourages our opponent to believe that we are serious about that. So this is about the establishment of commitment on our own side. What can we do in order to convince our bargaining opponent that we are really serious about the things that we are asking for, our demands, the things that are objectives in the bargain. The other side of this is about trying to prevent a similar approach from our opponents. We don't want them to be able to do to us what we're doing to them. So we're trying to think about how we would prevent our opponent from becoming committed or expressing that commitment. So all of the things that I've been talking about, things that we can do, little tactics, to demonstrate our commitment, we want to prevent them from being able to do the same thing. We want to block actions which confirm their commitment. We want to avoid transcripts of a negotiation. We want to be able to say, well, you never said that. I never heard that. That didn't happen. So that they can't claim the commitment that they may be referring to, that it was just missed by everybody. I don't know that this is important to you. You never said. And all of this kind of misattribution of things. We minimise the chances of our opponents from repeating claims, so they can't underscore, they can't increase prominence, they can't do these things. We use delaying tactics, so they can't put in place the tactical elements that we've been talking about. We put obstacles in the way of communication. Sometimes we may even change the negotiation team so they're not able to communicate with people more senior enough who could take those kinds of commitment statements seriously enough. Maybe we simply ignore them. Maybe it just never happened. Maybe we just provide the opportunities for our opponent to revise the commitments. Maybe we work very hard on increasing the security of our bargaining opponents with their principles, so that because their behavioural aspects of how they're behaving within the negotiation is regarded very strongly by their principals, so that they're able to compromise more on substantive elements, as we've discussed in previous topics. So this is a two-sided communication. We want to be able to establish firmness, and we want our opponents to, at all costs, to avoid them being able to make those commitments. And we play these games in order to make that so. There will be times when we have to abandon commitments, when we have to make concessions. This is a negotiation. This is about compromise. And so we have to be able to abandon those commitments that we spent so long and put so much effort into achieving, but we need to do it gracefully, and we need to do it in a way that doesn't expose us to looking weak. So what are the principles on which we can establish this? What are the protocols? Now sometimes it's as simple as, whose turn is it? Who should be doing it next? That I made the last concession, so now it's you. If I have to make two in a row, that makes me look weak, so it must be you. You must find something for me to move again. Sometimes it might be that we identify a particular kind of concession that unblocks movement more broadly within the negotiation. So there may be a key logjam, and we may say, well, we're prepared to do this in order that we can move across this broader range of issues. Sometimes it's done as an explicit trade. I'll do this if you do this. So tit for tat, that you must get what you require in order for you to concede something. Or I'll do this, but you will have to do this other thing before I will move again. So we think about different kinds of trades, and this is where it's important to know what the relative value of various bargaining items might be for you and for the other side in order that you can make those trades worthwhile and to your advantage. Sometimes we may want to abandon commitments in a more implicit way, so that we're not exposed to any charge of weakness at all. So it's not just a kind of procedural thing, but more subtly. So maybe we try to abandon commitments in a way that our opponent was not certain that there ever was a commitment in the first place. So it wasn't actually a withdrawn commitment, it just was never there. And so we need to be quite subtle in our form of communication. So maybe we're able to silently drop an issue. We just stop pressing on this thing and it never goes anywhere, and it doesn't become part of the overall agreement. It just disappears. We allow it to silently disappear into a black hole. Maybe sometimes we need to find a new logic in order to accept movement on an issue. So we respond to new argument or new facts that changes the way that we think about a particular issue. It gives us an out, it gives us a reason for retreating that's not simply about giving way, it's about saving face. Sometimes we may claim the higher ground by saying that we will abandon a commitment out of concern for something that is really important, like national security or the general good or whatever it might be, so that we attempt to gain the moral high ground. Maybe we only abandon commitments when there is a mediator brought in, so that it's seen as a third party who is identifying the appropriate response across the negotiation, rather than just saying, and you should give way on this and you should give way on that. But above all else, if we're going to abandon commitments, they should come at a price. We should exchange them for something else.